Hi everyone, welcome to our Lord's Day Holy Reading. Glad you could be here, and we're ready to get going.
All right, welcome everybody here in person and online. Glad you could make it. We're continuing on in week 8 of Thomas Manton's Treatise of Self-Denial. Matthew 16:24, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself. And we've come to part 4 of the first doctrine that he's covering in this treatise, and which is the helps which the Scripture prescribes for our furtherance in so good work. And we have a couple of, early on, a couple of readings from John Gill that are both very excellent, and he references himself. So anyway, fourthly, to give you the means of self-denial, whereby this work may be made more easy. Number 1, if you would deny yourselves, lessen your esteem and your affection to worldly things. So you can have esteem and some affection to worldly things, but you should always be looking at where that is at and whether they are. I mean, there are some obviously that should not be esteemed at all. So he says, if you would deny yourselves, lessen your esteem and your affection to worldly things. I join them together because affection follows esteem. If you would deny yourself for Christ, you must prize the worst of Christ before the best of the world. That's there is no worst of Christ, but it surely makes the point, doesn't it? See Psalm 84, verse 10. I had rather, saith David, be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of wickedness. When an earthen pitcher is broken, a man is not troubled at it, because he hath not set his esteem and heart upon it. A trifle. What made Moses so eminent for self-denial that he could refuse all the honors of Pharaoh's court and choose rather, quote, to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season? It is said, he esteemed the reproach of Christ to be greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. Hebrews 11, verse 25. Moses' esteem was set right. And John Gill really covers the aspect of affliction well in this. It's just Hebrews 11:25, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. The Israelites, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God, the Israelites who were God's chosen and peculiar people and were the true worshipers of him. Moses chose to be with those, the company and conversation of such. And I like this too. The company and conversation, the life of such is most eligible to every good man, because God is with them. His word and ordinances are with them. And he's talking about with them, the true people of God. His word and ordinances are with them. There are large provisions of grace in the midst of them, we can look at ourselves and see that. So that it is profitable, delightful, and honorable to be among them, and is attended with comfort, peace, and satisfaction. But it turns here, but then those are, my word also, but then those are also a poor and afflicted people. Affliction is with them. Count on it, for the sake of God and Christ and the truths which they profess and the worship and service they are engaged in. All brings affliction. And their afflictions are many and grievous. Moses chose to suffer these with them, to suffer the same afflictions they did, and to sympathize with them. And this was more eligible to him than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, meaning either the pleasures, honors, and riches in Pharaoh's court attended with sin, as indulging himself in the luxury of a court when his brethren were in distress, approving Pharaoh's cruelty and persecution, at least conniving at it and not opposing it, which is all the things that would have happened to him, which could not be without sin, carrying himself as the son of Pharaoh's daughter when he was a Hebrew, and preferring his own, this is all that he gave up, and preferring his own ease to the deliverance of his people. And now these, had he continued, would have been but for a short season, or else sinful lusts in general are intended, in which men promise themselves much pleasure when it is only imaginary, and lasts but for a while too. And the reasons which might induce Moses, every good man, to such a choice may be taken partly from the nature of afflictions themselves, which are such that God has chosen for them. He chooses afflictions for us, and appointed them unto, and which he gives them to suffer in his name. So it's an honor, and which are an honor to them, and issue in their good, and in the glory of God, and partly from the nature of sinful pleasures. There is no, talking about sinful pleasures, there is no solidity nor satisfaction in the best of worldly enjoyments. There can be no true pleasure in sin. There is always bitterness in the end, and it issues in death, if grace prevent not. Now it was by faith Moses made this choice, self-denial, for it is manifestly contrary to flesh and blood, as we all know. It showed him to be a man thoroughly acquainted with the nature of sin, and that he looked beyond the things of sense and time to those of eternity. Again, lessen the affection. The greatness of our affection, the greatness of our affliction. Therefore, we are so troubled to part with things, because our hearts are too much set upon them. We greaten the things of the world in our esteem and affection. Then it is a trouble. It is more trouble to part with them for Christ's sake. It can be. Alas, all these outward things, they serve but to prop up a tabernacle that is always fallen, the world. But how shall we lessen our esteem and affection? Is that in our power? I answer, you may do much. Deny lusts in their first motion, ere they grow upon your esteem and affection, and prevail by delight in the soul. When anything begins to sit too close and too near the heart, it is good for a Christian then to be wary and ask this question: how shall I deny this for God, or can I? I mean, you ask the question, if something might have a hold of you so much, it's got you wrapped up that you would even contemplate going to that instead of Christ, you better look into it and go to Christ. When anything begins to sit too close and too near the heart, it is good for a Christian then to be wary and ask this question: how shall I deny this for God? 1 Corinthians 6, verse 12, quote, I would not be brought under the power of anything. Right, did I do the rest? No. Oh yeah. All things are lawful unto me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. 1 Corinthians 6:12. Though the objects you converse with all, that you get involved with, where was it? You converse with all that you get involved with, even though they're lawful, yet when they encroach upon the spirit, then deny them. That's usually, the canary in the what do you call it? Huh? Cavern or? Yeah, the shaft, the mine. Oops. your spirit is being so encroached upon by something, then you can see right very quickly that it's time to deny it totally. And then take heed what thou dost account thyself. What he's saying is where you stand, where you consider yourself to stand spiritually, which you will go into Romans 7:17. Do not count sin thyself. If you are God's and you are a true professing Christian, and that's what you profess, and you know that, when you sin, and I'll get more into that in just a minute, that do not count sin as something that you're doing because you like it. You don't. We'll get into that in just a minute in a great way. See how the apostle parts it, or explains it. Romans 7:17, it is no more I, but sin that dwelleth in me. Thou shouldest be able to say concerning all carnal desires, it is not I, but sin. There is an old and corrupt self. So thou shouldest not count the world, or the love of the world, is what he's saying, as what you're all about. And I decided to add, with John Gill, add Romans 7:15 and 16 to Romans 7:17, because it fleshes it out a lot fuller. And it has a lot to say as far as that part of Scripture that we've all read, and it's always something to think on as to what is the final crux of it all. Romans 7:15, for that which I do, I allow not. The apostle, having cleared the law, so the whole verse is, for that which I do, I allow not. For what I would, that do I not. But what I hate, that do I. For that which I do, I allow not. The apostle, having cleared the law from the charge of being the cause either of sin or death, and taken the blame to himself, proceeds to give an account of the struggle and combat he found in himself between the flesh and the spirit. Quote, that which I do, I allow not. That which he did was evil, since he allowed not of it. But this, since he would rather have not have done it. But this is to be understood not of any notorious crime committed by him, and repeated again and again, nor of a sinful course of life. For before his conversion he was not a profane man, but externally moral, and after his conversion had his conversation in the world by the grace of God in righteousness and holiness. A vicious course of life, being contrary to the grace of God implanted in him, and the doctrines of grace professed by him. He's talking about, but of internal lusts, the workings of corruptions in his heart, and which are real actions of the mind, together with the various frailties and infirmities of life. When that apostle says that what he did, I know not, his meaning is not that he was utterly ignorant of them, of their nature and operations, or that he was insensible of their motions and unconcerned about them, for his sense of them and concern for them are expressed by him in the strongest terms. I know, I find, I see, O wretched man, etc. But either that the efforts and effects of sin in him were so sudden and at an unawares that he was sometimes overtaken and held captive before he knew well where he was or what he was doing. Or the sense is that he had not a full knowledge of the evil of his heart, the corruptions of his nature, nor did he understand all his infirmities and the errors of his life. Or else the meaning is, I own it not as right, but confess it to be wrong. I do not acknowledge these actions as the productions of the new man. They are alien to him, but as the deeds of the old man. Or rather, I do not approve of them. I dislike, abhor, and detest them. I cannot excuse or palliate them, but must condemn them. So words of knowledge in the Hebrew language are expressive of love, liking, and approbation. See Psalm 1:6, on which the last text says, or a phrase expressive of strong affection. And so here, I do not like, love, and approve of these things, or I do not allow of them and indulge myself in them. I loathe them and myself for them. And is this talking like an unregenerate man? Can it be thought that the apostle speaks of himself as unregenerate or represents such a man? For what I would, that do I not. What he desired and willed was good, though he did it not. And so the Vulgate Latin version reads, for not the good which I would, I do. And so the next clause, but the evil which I hate, I do. And what was that? He would have had his thoughts always employed about the best things. He would have had his affections continually and alone set on God, Christ, and the things of another world. He was desirous to keep the whole law of God and do the whole will of God and live without sin, and as the angels do in heaven. Now such a will as this is never to be found in unregenerate persons. This is from God and the power of his grace. When he says he did not what he willed, what he was desirous of and bent upon, his sense is not that he never did any good thing he willed, for he did many good things, as every good man does, but he did not always do the good he willed, and never perfectly, nor anything without grace and strength from Christ. And he adds, but what I hate, that I do. Here's the explanation. Sin was what he hated, it being contrary to the pure and holy nature of God, to the good and righteous law of God, and was in itself, to his view, exceeding sinful. He hated vain thoughts, unclean desires, revengeful lusts, the secret motions of all sin in his heart, and the various evil actions of life, which can never be said of an unregenerate man who loves sin, delights in iniquity, and takes pleasure in them that do it. And yet what the apostle hated, he did. Occasionally. He wrought with his carnal eye. Letter I. He wrought with his carnal eye, his flesh, and through the power of it, and force of temptation, though not without reluctance, remorse, and repentance. Romans 7:16, if then I do that which I would not, consented to the law that it was good. So if then I do that which I would not, this is a corollary or an inference from what he had related of his own experience, that since what he did, though it was contrary to the law of God, yet was what he did not will nor allow of, but hated. It must be a clear point that he consented to the law that it was good, lovely, and amiable, that it forbade those things which were hateful, and commanded those things which were desirable to a good man, and so is acknowledged to be a very beautiful rule of obedience, walk, and conversation. In Romans 7:17, now then, it is no more I that do it, and this is the one that Manton specifically referenced, and why we came to this. Now then, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. And this is a great explanation. This is another inference deduced from what is before said, that since he did not approve, but hated what he did, when those things that he did, and willed the contrary, not he as spiritual, as born again, as a new man, a new creature that did it. See 1 John 3, verse 9. He says, but sin that dwelleth in me, the old man, the carnal eye, the evil present with him, the law in his members, which not only existed in him and wrought in him, and that at times very strongly, but dwelt in him, had its abode in him, as it has in all regenerate persons, and will have as long as they are in the body. So Mr. Manton touches on that. It is no more I, but sin that dwelleth in me. Thou shouldest be able to say something. Thou shouldest be able to say concerning all carnal desire, it is not I, but sin. There is an old and corrupt self. So thou shouldest the world thyself, that is none of thee. Luke 12, verses 15. Of course, Satan will tempt you in that area mightily. Take Luke 12, verse 15, take heed and beware of covetousness. What is the reason? For man's life consisteth not in the abundance of what he possesseth. It is not thyself, your abundance of possessions. Thou art neither further from the grave, nor the nearer to true contentment. I may be happy without all that. He says, I may be happy without this. So point 2, for help, means of self-denial, seek self in God. This is an innocent diversion. When we cannot weaken the affection, let us change the object. What is it that is so near to thee? Is it honor? Well, then seek honor in God. Do but change vain glory for eternal glory. That is a lawful seeking of self when we seek it in God. John 5, verse 44, how can ye believe that receive honor one of another, and seek not the honor that cometh from God? You may change your desires from vain glory into everlasting glory. John 12, verse 43, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. Speaking of the Pharisees. If a man did desire praise, where can we have better than to be praised with God's own mouth, in the face of all the world at the great day of accounts, when Christ shall proclaim you to be an heir of the crown of heaven. So for pleasure, if thy soul be drawn out to it, oh, remember there are no pleasures like to those chaste delights thou mightest enjoy by communion with God, the pleasures which are at his right hand forevermore. Affections are not abrogated, discontinued, but preferred. And we transplant our desires that they may flourish in a better soil. If thou desirest riches, turn out thy heart toward the good treasure God hath opened in the covenant, to be rich in grace and rich towards God. Point 3, if thou wouldest deny thyself, resolve upon the worst to please God. If everything that's bad goes bad for you, you still, I mean, even if everything that you could ever imagine in a worldly sense goes bad, you still deny yourself. You resolve, that's what he's saying. If thou wouldest deny thyself, resolve upon the worst to please God, though it be with the displeasure of yourselves and all the world. Usually we do not sit down and count the charges. We do not make our resolution large enough. He's talking about our day. When we take up the profession of religion, we look for maybe a little trouble, therefore are soon discouraged if it's a lot more than a little. Usually we give God but small allowance. We do not carry our lives and our estates in our hands, offering them up to him, as we should do when we take religion upon us. A man never comes to Christ rightly unless he gives up himself and friends and bids Christ take all, till it comes to such a resolution as Nazi-Anzen, he references him a lot. He was a great theologian in the 4th century. Read a little bit about him. And he was very, very gifted and talented and really dedicated it all to the Lord. And he wasn't perfect, but he was, I can see why Mr. Manton looks at him a lot and says, Nazi-Anzen had concerning his human learning, and he said, Nazi-Anzen, I never affected riches nor greatness in the world, only I have affected a little eloquence. He was a great speaker. And I will tell you how far I have affected it, that I have something of value to esteem as nothing for Christ. So men should give Christ liberal allowance. Then, when it comes to trial, thou wilt not be grudging. It is that thou didst count upon. Depart for Christ's sake. And number 4, take heed of confining thy welfare to outward means, as if thou could not be happy without such an estate, without so many hundreds in the world. I guess economically, beware of binding up thy life and contentment with the creature. For when we come to part with it, we can as soon part with our lives. The children of God resolve, quote, though the fig tree do not blossom and the labor of the olive fail, yet to rejoice in the Lord, Habakkuk 2:17 and 18. This should be a Christian's resolution, not to trust to the creatures, but in God, though all these things are gone. This is a holy independency. You're independent. You don't have anything to lose. You trust God totally. When our hearts are taken off from the creature, the men of the world have only a candle which is soon blown out, and a state that may easily be blasted. But the children of God have the sun, which can stead them without a candle. The Lord saith, Hosea 2, verses 11 and 12, I will cause their mirth to cease, speaking of the carnal Jews. Why? I will destroy her vines and her fig trees. All the wicked man's happiness is bound up with the vine and the fig tree, with his estate. Consider, your happiness doth not lie within yourselves, nor in any other creature, but in God alone. God in himself is much better than God in the creature. And that's something you see a lot today, people praising the creation. And they'll say, oh, God's creation is so beautiful and this and that and the other. But they don't look into God himself at all. We cannot see how it, God in himself is much better than God in the creature. Now carnal men, they prize God in the creature, but not God in himself. And therefore the first thing we must depend upon is that God is an all-sufficient God in himself. Not God and your friends, not God and your wealth, but God in himself. We cannot see how it can be well without friends and wealth and liberty. Therefore our hearts are glued to them. Oh, take heed of this. All these things are but several pipes to deliver and convey to us the influence of the supreme cause. They all point to the Lord, and they're all given to us, but we cannot worship them and put them before Christ. Therefore, still prize God and himself before God in the creature. Point 5, direction. Often act faith and look within the veil, or actuate faith is what I think it better said. And look within the veil. Send thy thoughts as spies and messengers into the land of promise. A man will better quit what he has, that he hath upon earth, when he hath strong expectations of heaven. Romans 8, verse 18. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Romans 8:18. When a man seeth that God hath laid up a more excellent glory for him, he will reckon these things are not to be named the same day. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 16. For which cause we faint not, but though our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. The apostle gives an account of his valor and resolution, how he was able to withstand the discouragements. Quote, we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are unseen. Heaven will satisfy all losses, and then the world is quitted with ease. Look, as the woman left her pitcher when she was acquainted with Christ, so when a man is acquainted with better things, his heart is taken off from these outward things. When Christ said to Zacchaeus, salvation has come to thy house, then he, Zacchaeus, presently added, half my goods I give to the poor. When the heart is much in heaven, the earth will seem a small thing. When we look upon the stars, they seem but as so many sparks and spangles. But if we were above the earth, the world would seem but like a little black spot. Point 6 out of 7. In all debates between conscience and interest, between your conscience and a worldly interest, be sure to observe God's special providence to thyself. When conscience and interest are a struggling, consider, whence hadst thou that which thou art so unwilling to part withal, but from the Lord? Distrust, here's that line I was talking about. Distrust is the ground of self-seeking. We do not consider the providence of God to us, and that all changes are in his hands, and therefore we cannot deny ourselves. Who is that which gave thee such an estate that thou art loth to lose, or such a comfort thou art unwilling to part withal? When Amaziah, the king of Judah, was admonished by the prophet not to let the army of Israel go with him, quote, "What shall I do, saith he, for the 100 talents?" 2 Chronicles 15:9, the sum for which he had hired them. And the man of God answered, "The Lord is able to give thee much more than this. So when thou art troubled, say, How shall I do to live? What shall I do for an estate? The Lord is able to give thee more than this. It is God's blessing that maketh rich, and he can supply thee with a great deal more if he sees fit. Men think it is their own providence that doth all, and so they are loth to part with what they have. Consider, thou couldst not have this if God had not given it thee. So when men are loth to lose their friends, when by the profession of religion they lose them, they may be in danger thereof. Remember who brought them to be thy friends. Proverbs 16, verse 7, when a man's ways please the Lord, he makes his very enemies to be his friends. Piety will do more than carnal compliance. Thou mayest by this hazard God and thy friends too. And point 7, last one of our day. Consider the right God hath in all that is thine. He hath a natural right and a right by contract, a natural right to all thou hast. He made it and he gave it thee. No creature can be sui juris at his own power and disposal. Riches are not thine own, but God's bounty to thee. Foolish men account all that they have their own. They think they may do with it as they list. Psalm 12, verses 4, our tongues are our own. Who is Lord over us? Consider, thy tongue is not thine own, for it was not made by thee. And when it is blasted, thou cannot repair it. A prodigal that is not able to deny his pleasure, speak to him about it, and he will answer, I hope that which I spend is my own. Thy estate is not thy own, to spend it as thou pleasest. So covetous men think they are absolute lords of what they have. 1 Samuel 15, verse 11, shall I take my bread and my drink and give it to strangers? Goods must be laid out according to the owner's will, God, else it is robbery. Now all that thou hast is God's, therefore thou art to part with every interest and concernment of thine, as it may be for his glory. And you can look at everything in your life, and all these tips on self-denial can be looked at in the way that he's talking about, giving up your control over everything. God hath a right also by contract. Thou hast given up thyself and all that is thine to God. Romans 12, verse 1. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And do but consider the danger of alienating things that are once consecrated. Consider what was the end of Ananias and Sapphira. Mm-hmm. So that comes to the end of our section today, and willing, we'll pick up with this. I'll read it. Before I come to the particular kinds of self-denial, we'll take some observations concerning this duty. If you would deny yourselves, and he has several points to go through. So Lord willing, hopefully you can make it again. We're glad you could be here today, and everyone here. And may God bless you and teach you by his Spirit. And next week, Lord willing.
All right. Amen. Thank the Lord. And everyone on the line, yes, Lord willing, we will talk to you again soon. Go in God's truth. Bye for now.